For this video I will be reading from an art historian's website which is linked in the description. This website helps us to understand why black imagery began to appear in Europe post-12th century. It wasn't because black people were the dominant race of the time, but instead European politics. Europe had fears of its own, as this article I'll now read from will elucidate. One of the most beautiful art histories that I encountered during my years of research into the imagination of black in the Dutch, Flemish art, were the miniatures and manuscripts in which Africans can be seen. One surprising figure after another surfaced. Unfortunately, these works are rarely lent and we could show only a few examples in the exhibition Black is Beautiful in 2008. An interesting example is that in the period that the Burgundian Duke Philip the Good, who lived from 1396 to 1467, there was admiration for Ethiopians. This appreciation can be found in both in literature, and in the arts and has hardly been investigated. What lies behind these sometimes intriguing works? A first step of the research was then to find out what was going on historically in that period. Philip the Good inherited the rule over the Netherlands and was familiar with Africa. An important link with the continent was his wife Isabella of Portugal, 1397 to 1472, who he married in 1430. Portugal was 2 centuries earlier reconquered by the Christians on the Muslims, and the country drove, at the time of Philip, extensive trade with Black Africa. In the 15th and 16th centuries, the population of the southern European cities, such as Lisbon, became increasingly darker due to the immigration of Africans and, especially the import of African slaves. Portugal itself had no exchange value for the African countries and imported goods from Burgundian territory, Luxembourg, northern France, the Netherlands. So in Flemish cities like Ghent, Brussels, Antwerp and Bruges, were also Africans to be seen, who came along with the southern European merchants. And besides people from Africa who came, or were taken, African art also reached the Netherlands. Philip's son Charles the Bold, 1433 to 1477, was probably the first Northern European to purchase in 1470, African idols from the Far Alvear, servant of Master Jan of Alverkerk. The presumably wooden statues are unfortunately lost. We do not know how they look like. Also the gold and the jewelry, which at that time were taken from Africa and traded, disappeared, like most South American valuables. The objects are probably melted down. Only African Portuguese ivory and other forms of metal art from that period survived in several private and public collections. Another historical event that influenced the imagination of Black Africans in the visual arts was caused by the threat from the East. While the world in the West became larger and offered more trade opportunities, a new danger was approaching from the East in the form of the Ottomans. The conquest of Constantinople in 1453 on the Christians by the Ottomans made a great impression on religious and secular leaders, including Philip the Good. These leaders went looking for other Christian allies in the world against this new Muslim enemy. The Europeans became increasingly focused on Ethiopia. They knew this land for centuries as Christian. The Pope of that time Calixtus III, reigning from 1455 to 1458, claimed to have contact with legendary Christian Prester John, priest King John, of Ethiopia. This mythical king lived since the 12th century in the imagination of Europeans. Probably the Pope was thinking that the Ethiopian king of that time was Prester John. It was thought in Europe that Ethiopian rulers were the only ones who could claim the real royal blood. They descended directly from Solomon. Solomon, the third king of Israel, according to the Ethiopian history written in the Kebra Nagast, the Glory of Kings, had begotten a son with Queen Sheba. This son became King Menelik I of Ethiopia. The 15th century king of Ethiopia, it was thought, was a direct descendant of him. The kings of Ethiopia had extraordinary powers and forces, it was also thought. Europeans assumed that the king possessed a great and mighty army, and that he had the power to change the flow of the Nile. He had the tools to beat the Arabs in Egypt. Ethiopians were more than welcome in Europe. In 1452 an Ethiopian ambassador named Horki, arrived at the court of King Alfonso V of Portugal in 1432 to 1481, also called Alfonso the African. The ambassador was sent to Philip the Good in the Netherlands. That Philip the Good was expecting good things from black Africans is reflected in the work of the Flemish miniaturist Loysen Lie Edit, commissioned by Philip. In one of the manuscripts of Loysen Lie Edit, La Fleur des Histoires, Folio 7, 1455 to 1460, we see a representation of the reinstallation of Constantine the Great, about 280 to 337, at Constantinople. The three black escorts are probably Ethiopians. The men wear 15th century fashion. The dark man in middle front could depict a king or dignitary. He wears the clothes and hat of a highly placed person. On his neck he seems to have a golden chain. Typical of the Western view of Africans are the golden earrings and the band around the head of one of the other men. On another miniature, Henri de Montauban, from 1468 to 1470, is an African ambassador. On folio 387 arrives a black ambassador of the great Cognac King Brian. Priest John, Prester John, continued for centuries afterwards to inspire the imagination throughout Europe. Until the 18th century in Europe, heroic portraits of him can be found. Perhaps this is why in Middle Age European literature, as well as artwork, one example being Titian's Adoration of the Magi, the black figures are always described specifically as being Ethiopians, rather than Africans.